Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. Today I am with Charlie, who's going to introduce our special guest for today.
Thank you so much, Beth. It's really lovely to do an episode with you. Have we ever done one?
I was going to say, I don't actually think we've ever done one, so it's nice to be in the same Zoom room together.
Exactly. Well, this is a new dream team happening right here, Beth, and lovely listeners are going to get to hear something special. We're joined today by Mark Turnbull. He's an author and podcaster with a self-described, and I love this, passionate interest in the Civil War. So, yeah, it's someone I want to hang out with. He's the host of Cavalier Cast, which was the first and is currently the longest running podcast dedicated solely to the Civil Wars. His most recent book, Charles I's Private Life, was published by Pen and Sword in September, and he's here to tell us all about the man he found behind the monarch. Hi, Mark.
Hi, hi, Charlie. Hi, Beth.
It's just such a thrill to get you on here.
Thank you.
And to talk all things Charles I. How did you get obsessed with the Civil War? I've got to ask you that before we start.
I mean, this is going back some time now. I'll not mention the exact amount of years, but childhood visit to Helmsley Castle in North Yorkshire, and the gift shop with the usual haunt for kids. And there was, I loved history anyway, but there was this pack of cards, and I later bought the same pack of cards for my daughter, and it just had all of the monarchs of England on one side, pictures and images, and on the back a little bit of a description about their reign and them. And I was flicking through it, and really, I was interested in it. I wanted to draw some of them, and I just came across this Charles I card and looked at this amazing portrait, Charles I at the Hunt, Van Dyke, such a regal pose, and then read a little bit more and just found out, I think it said something along the lines of executed by his people, or something like that. And the two sides of this card were just completely at odds. And from that moment, I want to know more about this. I want to know more about him, about these wars, what actually happened. And, in the days pre-internet, it just sort of spiraled with stumbling across films like Cromwell, on repeat one morning, libraries, you name it, and then reenactment. So, it just goes on from there.
It's a rabbit hole we fall down, and obviously not great content for our listeners. But Mark, was the card similar to this card?
Yes, that's it. Yes.
Holding up the card of Charles II. Those packs of cards, guys, if you want to get your kids into history, get them one of those and they will love you forever. So the private life of Charles II is something I think all children and all adults are familiar with. But we speak relatively little about the private life of his father, Charles I. So I think the general assumption is therefore that Charles I had no private life worthy of discussing. Do you think he's being written off too easily?
It's like, isn't it? It's like when we think of our parents being sort of teenagers, and we think, oh no, they didn't like do these things, It's the same with Charles, isn't it? But yeah, I absolutely do think he's being, written off in that way, very much. And there's a few factors at play, I think. So, first of all, I'll say that he was a victim of his own success. So going back to 1623, when he was 23, so he made a trip to Madrid. He's trying to reverse the declining fortunes of the Stuarts, reclaim his brother-in-law's ancestral lands in the Palatine. And he wants to seize the nettle, so he's wanting to try and marry the Spanish Infanta. He thinks that through the terms of that he can bring that Palatinate lands back to his brother-in-law and sister. So it wasn't a flight of fancy. It wasn't foolish. There was 11 years of absolutely intense pressure over who he should marry. People planning his life for him. But he was completely wrong in the end. He tried and it just didn't work. He's diving over walls to try and catch her alone. He's leaning out of windows during public events to sort of catch a glimpse. They're driving past each other in carriages and he's watching as she drives past. Amazing. And I think he convinces himself that he's smitten. He says that he's in love. Perhaps he's in love with the idea because he has this romantic notion that he's some sort of knight errant, going off. But it wasn't
he's with Buckingham, isn't he? He's with the Duke of Buckingham on this jaunt.
Absolutely, yeah. And I suppose, yeah, who better to go on a jaunt of that sort than Buckingham? So I think it did well, the two of them together. But the biggest life-changing thing that this brought, I think, is Charles's desire to emulate the Spanish monarchy. So it's austere, proud, wealthy. They are very much like a godlike figure above the grime of politics. And Charles went on to hold his court in the same manner. So I think it was that formal and that access was so restricted. On the one hand, it completely suited his shy, unconfident manner. He once complained to the Earl of Strafford about being importuned by this peer who approached him off the cuff, with a petition. He finds it difficult sometimes to say no. But really, in the words of the late Queen Elizabeth II, the monarchy's got to be seen to be believed. So there's that side of it, that formal side, which I think we're left with, and that's how, it's easy to see, he hasn't got a private life, because he is such a formal, enigmatic figure. But, he's going out there meeting his public occasionally, and he's lifting his hat, which is a really, unusual gesture for a monarch to do to his people. I think he's doing a walk around, he's walking around meeting people, public are gathering around. But what he did, and he had a lot of support from segments of his ordinary people in all kingdoms, but he did upset the movers and shakers. In the gentry and sort of aristocracy, you either love him or you hate him with his style of monarchy. So yeah, I think we judge him based on that. And then more modern times, I think, it kind of gets more convoluted and more complex because you've got the martyr murderer two-dimensional image. But I think in today's time, with the decline of the church, that martyr image even is slipping. So we're almost left with what we feel more comfortable with in thinking about this man who, in a lot of words, what you read, declared war on his people. He's a tyrant. And that's kind of what you're left with, and that's what you judge him on, and that's what you see. And we lose sight of the man, and that's what I really wanted to sort of get to the crux of, who was he? How, what motivated him? How did his childhood affect, his beliefs?
And that goes perfectly into our next question, actually, doesn't it, Mark? Where we wanted to talk about Charles's childhood. So that's excellent. So Charles is one of those really interesting figures in the way that he wasn't born to be king. So he was a spare, as they call it. He had an elder brother, Henry. So can you tell us a little bit about Charles's childhood and the kind of relationships he had with his family?
Yeah, absolutely. And so many similarities with Henry VIII as well, about being the spare and sort of the interests and the characteristics, apart from there's some vast differences between the two, but then there's a lot of similarities. But I think for me, so like 3 recent biographies that I'd looked at, the first half of his life, so 23 years, kind of accounts for about 14%. And I always felt that there was, when I was reading about him in the time since that card at Helmsley Castle, I always felt like there was more that was missing about his younger years. There was a lot of focus on the Civil War, and that's defining, but not so much about how he grew up, you know. I think what you find is that many contemporaries say that he was his parents' favourite child. You get that quite a lot from different observers at the time. He was extremely close to his mother. And the key thing about his relationship with his father is that James didn't see him as a threat. Whereas with his elder brother, Prince Henry, there was a lot of friction there because Henry was just so glamorous that James didn't want to be upstage. But with Charles, the descriptions of Charles as a child are always sweet, nice-natured, kind, willing to please, I would say. So there are a lot of tender moments in what is a difficult and complicated childhood. He's the youngest member of the family, so perhaps the parents dote on him.
They call him baby Charles, don't they?
Yeah, which, so embarrassing. It must have been so embarrassing. Even when he's 23, he's baby Charles. But that name itself, it is quite a branding in terms of all of your younger siblings that came after you. 3 children all died, and it must have reminded him in a way, or must have made him think, well, why have I survived? And then obviously Henry goes on to die, his elder brother. So it does make, I think that does affect Charles. It must really have made him think, well, God's favoring me, perhaps he's got a mission for me, or and so he had a lot of early health problems, but he was never overlooked. So even from his early years, he was being earmarked as sort of a Stuart pawn. Despite the sickness, I was totally surprised that there was suggestions that he could become a King of Scotland, Viceroy of Ireland. There was even a proposal that he might sort of somehow take on the Spanish Netherlands. So yeah, definitely he's not just a forgotten, sickly baby, toddler child. But in his childhood and younger years, he definitely idolized his brother Henry. But again, he was no means outshone by Henry. So James is once described, or once sort of gave a bit of a shot to Henry by saying, I'll leave the throne to Charles because he is the fastest at learning. Henry wasn't a particularly enthusiastic studier. But Charles, the other thing that strikes me is that from a young age, he was so content in his own skin. He knew what his likes and dislikes were. Yes, he wanted to emulate Henry, but he didn't want to be him. And then everything changed when Henry died.
So how old is Henry? How old is Charles when Henry dies?
So I think Henry's 18 and Charles is just coming up to 12. It's just short of his 12th birthday. And the last visit at the bedside, Charles takes this small bronze statue of a horse and, pushes it into his brother's hands. And Henry's probably too far gone to sort of recognize this, but that horse stays in the collection. But, from the moment of Henry's shock death, and it was a big shock, that's when Charles had to be his brother. He had to be Henry. And I think that really made him lose a sense of his own identity. And perhaps from that moment, he's characterized in one respect. He's characterized in one respect as being uncertain of himself. And, people see that as weak. But he was a very strong man, strong principled, strong character. Didn't look physically as athletic as Henry, but certainly was up to the same ability. But people were really harsh and critical at the time, and there have been ever since. Nadine Ackerman's biography of Elizabeth of Bohemia, I noticed an article in the press that titled, big sort of headline saying "Weedy Brother." And that really just carries through to this day. Charles is just weedy. He wasn't anything until Henry died, and then he struggled and then failed. But the one thing that stands out for me with that title is that aged 11, You know, we remember the funeral of Diana, Princess of Wales, 1997. You know, we think of Prince Harry and Prince William walking behind the coffin in streets, sort of teeming with emotion. And Harry spoken of the effects. But in 1612, you've got Charles, just short of his 12th birthday, doing the same. You know, a city equally, you know, bereft, you know, desperate, you know, really upset. And he is leading the nation. You know, his family, the king, the queen, his sister, all shut themselves away. They don't attend the funeral. You know, they're grief stricken. He was the only member of the royal family present, and he had to shoulder that.
Yeah.
And I
Quite a
can't
burden
imagine the effect.
for a young lad. That's a lot. That is. I mean, we still, like you say, we talk about it in contemporary terms. That's a lot for a young lad.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the other thing, it would be great, wouldn't it, to see what he thought. But then in some of the research, what I did find is a sonnet that he penned to his mother. It's undated, but I would, you know, judging by the handwriting and everything, you're looking at, it's definitely after Henry's death.
Yeah.
But it could be when Charles is between 13 to 18. And what he's trying to do is explain to his mother how sonnets are constructed. And he writes, the daily fashery or troubles had quenched the heavenly furious fire that once burned in him. So he goes on to say, in place whereof came sad and thorny cares, which restlessly no time or season spares. And I really do think that captures as close as we can get to how he felt his life had changed. You know, it must have just been, you know, an unremitting lot of sad and thorny cares that were loaded on him.
That's really beautiful, and I think, you know, that sort of suggests what he would be very much applauded for later, which is his love of art and beauty, and the royal collection that he put together was just incredible. So it does give us a sense very, very much of the man that he was. But we're going to jump forward. We need to jump forward a little bit, and we're not doing the life of Charles I here. We're doing the man. So he becomes king, guys. Sorry, spoiler. But then there's been some debate, and this has been, I mean, one of the things that Twitter is so wonderful for. There's been some debate recently that you were involved in on Twitter about the official start of the Civil War, all the wars of the Three Kingdoms, or the wars of the Five Peoples, however we're gonna title it. Now, the history books, you open any history book, it's going to say 22nd of August 1642. But what does this debate that we're having on Twitter, what does it reveal to us about Charles I?
Yeah, well, so you're right there, and I think firstly, I'll just point out for listeners that so War of the Three Kingdoms is the entire, you know, conflict across the Three Kingdoms. But what I'm going to refer to is the English Civil War. So it's not taken away from the War of the Three Kingdoms, but a civil war didn't begin formally in England until, well, this is the question, until what the history books say is the 22nd of August, 1642, when Charles raised his standard. So, when researching the biography, I mean, I came across this details of a letter from the Venetian ambassador, and it said in a letter home, Parliament has just declared war on the king. And that, you know, I sat up immediately and thought, what? You know, this is, how on earth did Parliament declare war on the king? Looked into it a bit further, and there was formal declarations from the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and you know, I found that they debated the wording of this formal, significant statement in the Lords on the 2nd of August, and the ambassador is referring to that document that was published, probably published maybe the 3rd or the 4th. We're not sure when. I'd gone with the 4th. Because that's when John Rushworth had mentioned it, who later went on to be Thomas Fairfax's secretary. But the Venetian ambassador mentions, or 2 days ago, or a few days ago, it was published, and that's why there's a question that could be the 3rd. But, you know, that's immaterial. I think the point here is that is nearly 3 weeks before Charles raised his standard. And the thing for me is that that completely changes, I think, how the start of that formal side of the conflict should be looked on, and then by default, how we look on Charles. So we just had the anniversary and social media. I put a blog post out. I saw it all over that day. Charles first declared war on his people.
So he's a bad man, because he did that. He started it.
Yeah,
effectively.
That's it.
That
Yeah.
says.
He started, he unleashed it. He's the one that formally unleashed it. And if it wasn't for him, perhaps it wouldn't have happened. Perhaps some negotiations might have occurred, which is very, very simplistic. And as you said, I've looked at history books, and that was such a shock to me because I've never read anything like that. But I just assumed when I read it that, perhaps it was out there somewhere and I just hadn't read it. But then checked it a little bit, and then I did that blog post, and there was a lot of comments and feedback, and then really found that actually, it is something that was very underexplored. It wasn't well known. But really, Charles didn't declare war on his people by raising his standard. That's a fact. I think everybody would, historians will agree on that. I think that he didn't declare war on his people. He's proclaiming the core of men at Parliament as traitors. But Parliament had formally announced that it was taking up arms against the king's evil counsellors, well, basically the king, and raising an army against them. And they are saying we're going to live and die in the cause. They are justifying in sort of paragraphs after paragraph why they're doing this, sort of a little bit like the Grand Remonstrance back in 1641. They're digging up everything, all the dirt, and sort of saying this is why, rightly or wrongly, digging up all of the dirt that they can to say this is why we're raising the army. And the Earl of Essex's commission from the month previous to that, in July, from Parliament, he'd been ordered to invade, resist, repress, subdue, pursue, slay, and kill. So Parliament's commander has that order. Yeah. So my thoughts are that both sides didn't want to open hostilities. They kind of goaded one another to try and get the other one to do it. And there was a lot of skirmishing up and down the country going on before this. But the point is here, it's not formal. And I think they knew that whoever took it formal could potentially get cast as the aggressor. Only the king had the power to declare war. But at the end of the day, what those declarations were is a declaration of war in all but name. And Charles couldn't not, respond to that. He's a legitimate king. There's an army in his kingdom that's not his. How can anyone look on that? But yeah, looking at Charles, what does that tell us? I think straight away, he's not a bellicose tyrant just unleashing war on his people. The context, I think, shows that he was on the back foot yet again, because he often was. He was no great politician. He had his moments, but on the whole, he was very reactive when Parliament was extremely adept at managing the situation. Charles really wasn't. So yeah, the perception of that standard raising feeds into this tyrant murderer, counters that other extreme about martyr. And I think, yeah, it just shows, doesn't it, that here's another reactive situation. Charles perhaps is being painted in one way, and that's not necessarily the truth. I think it takes two to tango, doesn't it? And clearly they were tangoing up and down the country before that.
We're going to move now to kind of one of the crucial moments that you argue about in the book. So we're going to talk about when Charles was refused entry into Hull, and you kind of talk about how this may have been a personal betrayal by a childhood friend, which sounds very intriguing. Could you tell us a little bit more about this and what that reveals on Charles's character and experiences at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so it's a crucial moment. I mean, Charles himself called that refusal, so the governor of Hull refusing to let Charles into Hull months before the standard raising, Charles called that an act of war. And many at the time saw it as the start of war. So we've got Sir Richard Bulstrode who's saying war had been openly declared against the king. And there's a plaque there now that commemorates the event, and it says it was the first overt act of the Civil War. But it's the memoirs of Charles' second son, James, Duke of York, and he's really scathing about this so-called friend, William Murray. So Murray is a Scotsman. He'd been a friend of Charles's since childhood. He was the nephew of Charles's childhood secretary, Thomas Murray. But he was an absolute born intriguer. So backstairs politics, you've got William Murray there all the time. He doesn't hold an official government position. He's a groom of Charles's bedchamber, obviously very close to Charles. But he's constantly in touch with Charles's enemies. He's in touch with Covenanters. He's trying to put across to the parliamentarians when they were attempting to get Charles to give up the militia. He was the one that was conveying, well, he won't do it. It's part of the coronation oath, and he feels like he's given away too much already. So yeah, the other thing with this is that behind the scenes there was a real battle for dominance between English and Scottish courtiers. So on the whole, Charles and his father had Scotsmen in positions of influence, or certainly like close to them in the main. And I think Murray is definitely one of those Scots who's trying to sort of intercede. But yeah, it was quite interesting to see how James referred to him. And James wrote his memoirs a lot later in life.
Yeah.
But even then, he's still quite scathing of Murray. And I think there was a namesake. There was another William Murray that was in James's household at the time.
Right.
And he refers to his father's friend, William Murray, as the dishonest one of the two. So yeah, so apparently, you've got the Duke of York, James, Duke of York, and the king's nephew, the Elector Palatine. They had been sent to Hull as a bit of an advanced reconnaissance, maybe, bit of a visit. They got entry. They were entertained in Hull, and Charles decided on St. George's Day to make his way there and try and gain control of the town and the stash of munitions in it, because Parliament had appointed John Hotham as the governor. But so Charles sends advance notice that he's going to arrive. Hotham gets this, and it's said by James, Duke of York, that a notice came from William Murray of Charles's bedchamber, warning Hotham, if the king gets into the town, he's going to proceed against you for your life. And of course, Hotham, according to James, then stands firm on the walls and refuses entry to Charles. So it could explain why John Hotham was really categorical in refusing the king entry. I mean, he'd already let his son in and his nephew.
Yeah. So
why the difference? Is it because he knew what Charles's game was? Or is it because he'd been tipped off, actually? And the Hothams, they were whichever way the wind blew. So they would go whichever side they thought could give them the best outcome. So they were parliamentarian. They would later flirt with the royalists, and they ended up both being executed.
It tends to happen. So this betrayal. So the fact that William Murray sends this note, allegedly revealing what the king's going to do when he's let in, that's what Charles is upset about, that he thinks he's overstepped or he's said too much. Was that his? Do we think that then was his actual plan, or do we think William Murray's just stirring the pot?
Well, so James, Duke of York, writes later that there was no truth in it,
right,
and that Charles wasn't going to arrest him and try him. I mean, I suppose we'll never know. But I mean, Charles was certainly probably no he was probably wary of Hotham. But whether he would have proceeded against him, I just think it probably wouldn't serve his purpose to do that, you know, to just proceed against somebody who enjoyed Parliament's confidence. So it's a bit of a, you know, one that I suppose we'll never know what his intentions were, but certainly he wanted to get to Hull because of those munitions. But I think what's definitely telling is that Charles, there's nothing to suggest that Charles was upset by this, you know, so there's nothing other than James's writings to say that Charles was betrayed. And Charles never outwardly condemned Murray, and Murray never lost his place, never lost his influence. You know, that was always there, you know, continued by the king's side. So I think outwardly, at least, Charles retained confidence in Murray. But that was one of Charles's fatal flaws. You know, potentially Charles believed that the majesty of his position, you know, he believed in divine right, he believed in his monarchy and him as king so much that he often couldn't begin to appreciate that others might not, and that perhaps if somebody betrayed him, you know, it was Charles's duty as a, you know, as a responsible king to show clemency. You know, that was one of the greatest powers of monarchy in Charles's eyes, to show clemency and allow people to make right their wrongs. But the problem is, you've strayed away, you know, in Charles's position as a king, and a king in that time, he's got people who betray him, who snitch on him, you know, let things slip. They get welcomed back in the fold. Nothing's changed. They sometimes get peerages, you know, they get the rewards. So in the end, you've got people that just think, well, this is transient. And so if something happens with Charles and I disagree with it, I'll just say so. I'll go and support his enemies. I know that I'll always get back into the fold, because, you know, we'll work around the king, or, you know, he'll just show that clemency. And people really, there are contemporaries that complain about this, that he's just too often forgiven, you know, not ruthless enough. And yeah, so I think that part of what killed him was clemency, you know.
Yeah, I think you really hit a nail on the head there with Charles, in that, you know, he's not one of our, he needed to be a warlike monarch, but he's just not, and that's why he fails. But in so many ways, we could probably look at the man now and say, actually, you know, I'd much rather have him in charge than the guys who won, because he's kind, he's forgiving, he likes art, he's probably a bit too trusting for his own good. He's not the kind to sort of scream and shout and bluster, but when we hold him up against his son, he can appear to be reserved, quiet, cold, aloof, lofty and proud. These are words that kind of that we really associate with Charles I. So spending time with him and knowing him as you do, was this your assessment of the man? Is that right? Is he cold? Is he just a little bit?
No, he's absolutely no cold fish at all. I mean, his monarchy was just that. You know, he's aloof, lofty, and proud. Absolutely. You know, these idealist tendencies that he had deluded him from reality, really. You know, so Civil War wise, I think as a king, he's seen it like a giant mask. You know, he's foolish and trusting people again and again. He thinks that he can sweep in, you know, use sort of the Knight of the Garters, you know, that sort of honor to sort of bring people around, you know, convince people. And politically, you know, all of that just showed him as politically weak, but he wasn't a weak man. The man, I found, you know, examples of where he's kind, caring, you know, he's tenderly devoted to his family. You know, in his youth, as I said, he's always known as sweet, kindly natured. But I think that's the thing, you know, that there's so few people at court that could probably see that close side of him. And if they didn't write it down, then that can get lost, you know. So, you know, he had to fight from the start for for survival and overcome these health impacts. So yes, he could be prone to fits of rage, jealousy, vanity, but I think that's just like anyone in history and us, He's no different to anybody. It's just what, like with a lot of historical figures, if people haven't written down moments of tenderness or, moments they've observed when somebody's being very kind, then that can get lost, especially for a king, or someone who's meant to be in that position. You view them on that pedestal. So I think things that I noticed were that he defends his ministers when they're criticized. So he's actively saying, don't criticize them, they're acting on my orders. Whether they are fully acting on his orders or not, he's putting his neck on the line to his own detriment.
Yeah. His neck turned out to be really his downfall, didn't it?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, he's publicly supporting William Laud, before the war. But even so, that's quite a tricky point to put yourself on.
Well, that's a hard sell, because his devotion to his archbishop, his devotion to his view of a complete church across all of his kingdoms. This does feel to me to be really where he finds his match, his downfall, is in trying to impose the Anglican faith on the Scottish church, and thinking that they'll just kind of go along with it because he's the king appointed by God. Here's my archbishop. We're going to make St. Giles a cathedral. Here's your bishop. You'll love him. Let's have a Bishop of Edinburgh. Goes down like an absolute, does not go down well. And he gets a stool thrown at him, as in a chair. The bishops get a chair thrown at them, not poo. Should make that point. The Scottish weren't that rowdy. But he trusted them to just be obedient and just do what he said. And then when he hands himself into the covenanting army later on, they just hand him to Parliament, of course, because they are not loyal to him. They're loyal to their church. And he can't see that. He's completely blind to it.
Well, I think this is where the Civil War can be really complicated, because although they are joining Parliament, so the Scottish Covenanters are joining Parliament, for the Covenanters, they've got no issue with, they have got an issue with them, but as a king, they want to keep him. They don't want to lose him. He's a fellow countryman. So if they were to support the English Parliament, who want to get rid of the king or execute him even, the Covenanters are actually coming out in favour of Charles. They're saying, no, we don't agree with that, because who will the English put in place, and what impact will that have on Scotland? But yeah, I mean, as a man, just getting back to that side of things, he's defending Buckingham when Buckingham's assassinated. His greatest friend, probably his most devastating relationship of his life. He's paying off debt, supporting Buckingham's widow, taking Buckingham's children in, and raising them with his own, and then Buckingham's brother as well. So this is a guy who had a lot of problems, a lot of personal problems and health issues, and at the height of Charles's troubles with Scotland, he's in the north, dealing with the Covenanter armies, and at that point, he's writing to the carers of Viscount Purbeck, and he's given them advice, about sort of addictions and things like that, and alcohol, keep him away from alcohol, and I think that's the side of him that we don't see so often. Yes, there's the politics, the fact that he's engaged with the Covenanters there, but actually, this guy's writing off letters to, his dead best friend's brother and the carers to make sure that he's looked after and treated well. It's very personal, very personal. I think that does sum up, just how kind that he could be. He's not an evil man. He's certainly not an evil man or an evil king. He's misunderstood, yes, and he's not politically adept. But yeah, and the other thing that I do think is striking is that he's making speeches to Parliament, and he makes no bones about the fact that perhaps he has a stammer, and that, you know, he's not particularly good at speeches. He admits that in front of Parliament. And you think of George VI and the King's Speech. Charles is there in a very public arena, accepting and admitting this as they saw it, defect. I think that takes guts.
Really does.
And we're now going to look at another facet of Charles's character, because obviously his son Charles II, one of the things most people probably know about him is he's very promiscuous. Yep, Charlie knows. Yep, many mistresses, many illegitimate children. Where did Charles I, his father, sit on this? Was he a faithful husband? Did he have mistresses of his own? What was his character like in that regard?
So if I say pre-1648, he absolutely a faithful husband. Absolutely. And there's armies of people who sort of comment on this, from royal physicians, ambassadors, everybody's saying how devoted he is to Henrietta. But there is a disgraceful episode, I think, in 1648 when he's in captivity and he's lost the civil wars, and in Carisbrooke Castle, and he's chasing Jane Warwood, and you at that point in time when he's doing this, he's chasing after her and sort of writing letters and trying to make clandestine arrangements to meet her and things, and it's at that point when you've got the Scottish engagers crossing the border, marching into England in support of him. And I think that's quite a bitter thing to swallow, I think, when you've got men that are fighting and putting their lives on the line and the king's in captivity. Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing here. It could be Charles having some sort of breakdown. He can't cope with this powerless inactivity while such crucial things are happening. He wanted to escape to join them, and that just wasn't to be. He's getting stuck in windows. He can't get out of the castle. So yeah, it must have been quite a difficult time for him. But the other thing as well is that affront to fool his captors, because are these meetings, is he penning these letters and different things to sort of fool them, so that they look on the meeting with Jane and just think, oh yeah, he's gonna go for a caudle, as he sometimes got like a cuddle, it's Scottish term. But in actual fact, he's exchanging messages, and Jane's, taking that, out, and that's his communication with the outside world. So you can never tell, but I mean, certainly that, he does make every effort to see her. He's pining after her. But before he was king, there is so little about his private life and romantic life. There's tantalizing hints at this unidentified woman, and rumors about illegitimate daughter called Joanna or Joan Bridges, who later marries his chaplain. But there's no hard evidence.
But it's an excellent use of words.
Yeah. But as a character, he's self-controlled, he's abstemious, he is quite tough with himself. So I don't think that he would have too many dalliances if he did.
Yeah, I'm not going to be an apologist for bad behaviour in a marriage, obviously. But to be fair to Charles, his wife's been gone since what, 1644? Did she go after Marston Moor? You have to put me right if I'm wrong.
To the end of 44, yeah.
So he hasn't seen his wife for 4 years at that point. We can't deny him a little cuddle, can we?
Well, that's it, yeah, exactly. And the other thing that we've got to remember here is he's not hearing from his family.
No.
So, the letters are not able to get through from Henrietta. I think perhaps at that point there was some strain, because she wants him to surrender different terms. She wants him to give up bishops. He won't. And she can't understand his principles. And he's trying to convince her, that he's not just being stubborn. He's actually, genuinely has this principle at the core. So yeah, you get, he's writing out to the Prince of Wales even, instructing, requesting, begging him to write more often. So yeah, he's completely cut off. He thinks that this solitary confinement, in the back of his mind, he's thinking that it could end with his murder in a corner. So yeah, who knows? That's the thing, isn't it? I agree. I don't think you can blame him. It doesn't necessarily look good when, as I say, armies are battling it out for him and he's running around saying to Jane that he wants to give her a good swiving, apparently, in the letter,
Oh my.
But yeah, just what was the full meaning of that?
Who knows?
But yeah, getting back to this early unidentified lady, it's this letter that involves Buckingham, which so basically Charles has been told off by his dad, and Buckingham sends him some comforts, and Charles, so he replies and he says, read this letter and then commit it to the safe custody of Mr. Vulcan. So in other words, burn it. And he said, the well-relished comforts you sent took the sting out of his father's telling off. But then he says, he's met the person that must not be named once already, and he'd meet her again on Saturday. So there's something there. There's
definitely something. Wow. We're going to have to start wrapping up, because otherwise I will talk to you all day, Mark. There's someone else I want to talk about who I know you talk about in your book, and I know this is going to be the thing that is going to make everyone go out and get a copy. So another mystery person, the identity of Charles's executioner. Now, it's always been something of a mystery, and without wishing to give anything away, because we want to go and get copies of the book, would it be fair to say that you have been playing detective? Do you have any new suspects?
I've definitely got a new suspect, yeah. If it was Cluedo, we'd have another character on there. Yeah, so I'd stumbled across this letter, absolutely stumbled across it. And it was written 40 years after its execution. But it does name somebody and makes an accusation. So, as you say, I'd been sleuthing it away through sort of news sheets and documents and things to try and piece this together and see, is it possible? Could it have happened? So there's a number of candidates, but I don't think, I think apart from the city executioner, Richard Brandon, the other candidates that have been proposed, there's always a question mark over it. And, and certainly, there will be question marks over anybody that's proposed, because we just, certainly at the minute, we won't know. There's no evidence out there to show exactly who it was. But definitely, I think that I've found somebody who can be put in the frame. There's, when you look at sort of pieces of evidence from what people have said, how they've described the executioners, and the problem is executioners. It's so the two men on the scaffold, the executioner who dealt the blow, and then the assistant who held the head up. They are described as executioners. So although one swung the axe, they're both executioners. So yeah, I definitely got another candidate there.
But we're going to buy your book and find out what you've got to say about this. It sounds absolutely fantastic. What do you think, Beth? Who done it?
Oh. I look forward to finding out.
Amazing. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. Guys, the Charles I Private Life by Mark Turnbull is available now, and I'm sure we'll put it in our bookstore so you can get a copy. But please grab hold of a copy and check out Cavalier Cast as well, right, Mark?
Oh yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah.
Amazing. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having us. That's been brilliant and thoroughly enjoyed it.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/historyhack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.